All right, folks, welcome to one of the, not the final, but one of the final lectures for American Lit 1. Um, we've just finished a series of longer fictional prose texts. And so this week I'm gonna talk about literature of social reform. And we talked about this in class. I mentioned this phrase in class. So we were discussing Life in the Iron Mills by Rebecca Harding Davis. And so you're going to get a little bit of that um, here today. So, what is literature of social reform? You see two examples on this slide from the 19th century. One is the most famous example of social reform literature in the 19th century, which is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Um, and then right by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and then right next to that is a not as famous but still really significant um, text called Winema, A Child of the Forest by Alice Callahan. Um, so I have those as examples of two novel-length texts that we're not reading in our class this semester, but that should be on your radar as social reform literature in 19th century American lit. Um, so what is literature of social reform? It is literary writing, so beyond so stuff that's not just like journalistic reporting, but novels, poems, plays, literary essays. Literature of social reform is literary writing that explicitly addresses socio-political issues. Emphasis on explicitly. A lot of fiction you can look at and say, oh, this is about insert political issue here. Social reform literature is explicit and you hear me use the phrase heavy-handed. It is telling you this is a story about poverty. This is a story about racism. This is a story about sexism, right? Life in the Iron Mills, the text that we read in our class, explicitly is telling the reader this is about poverty and the exploitation of the working class, right? It's not an allegory or an analogy or subtle or it is right there on the page, right? So lot there like a lot of literature is somehow about political issues. Social reform literature is when that becomes explicit, right? Um, so this has always been true of literature, right? Literature in every era, from every tradition that you can think of, national tradition, ethnic tradition, um, has somehow had a bunch of texts, a bunch of things that are about social and political issues. However, in the 18th and 19th century in US and British literature, uh, there started to consolidate a kind of like style, a kind of literature, where it was more than just what it was about, but how it was composed. And so we talk a lot in literature classes that the what and the how of literature are always equally important. What literature is about is important, but how literature is composed is as important as what it's about, right? And so in an English class and literature class is never just enough to say what is this story about, what is this poem about, but to discuss how a text is constructed and how a text constructs meaning. And so in the 19th century, you get this way that social reform literature um, almost becomes its own genre. Um, in the way that social reform literature kind of consolidates these three major isms, these three major movements in aesthetics in the 19th century: realism, naturalism, and regionalism. These are three key terms that, if you take American literature two with me, get more solidly defined. Because they are movements, they take on their full strength in American literature post-Civil War. The Civil War, in a way that I would explain in my American Lit 2 class, acts as this kind of historical break from the precedents of this first bullet point, melodrama and romanticism, which dominate fiction in a US context throughout most of the 19th century. Um, we talked about melodrama and romanticism earlier, much earlier in the semester when we were reading Royal Tyler's play The Contrast in the context of drama. Um, Quick reminder, melodrama and romanticism refer to the kind of fantastical elements of literature. Think about those elements in Joaquin Murrieta, where Joaquin comes across as a kind of like Count of Monte Cristo, like over dramatic, like jumping on a table with a flourish kind of hero. um the way that he is romanticized. So romanticism in literature, to remind you, doesn't just mean like characters fall in love like romantic, but romanticism refers to a kind of like romanticization of life itself, where you go beyond realism, where it's not necessarily realistic. It's kind of like dressed up, made more dramatic, made bigger feelings, bigger gestures, bigger movements, characters who are larger than life. Um, and that kind of dominates literature for most of the 19th century. But as you get closer to the Civil War, you start to see a turn towards these two forms called realism and naturalism, which I'll explain on the next slide, but basically kind of move away from the larger than life characters and plots and reground literary characters and narratives in a more realistic, true to life sense. Social reform literature bridges both of those things. But I mean both of those things, meaning both sides of that turn, both the melodrama and romanticism and the realism and naturalism, um where you also get a particular form of realism which is called regionalism. So realism is more broadly like being realistic. Regionalism says being realistic but with faith to a particular location, setting, region of the country. So Life in the Iron Mills is a regionalist story about Appalachia, right? So regionalism is characterized as not only realistic in terms of character creation, but in terms of putting you in a setting and being true to that setting. Um, so uh social reform lit strives for this kind of photographic fidelity of to reality like realism does, meaning when you're reading it, these stories are trying to activate your five senses to make you feel like you really are in this setting, and kind of getting a sense of what these experiences are in order to give you that political message of where reform is needed, right? So again, think of Life in the Iron Mills, think of um the attention to setting and how tone itself comes through the five senses, right? Rather than the narrator telling you that this is a depressing story, the narrator attacks your five senses with gray clouds and smog and how it feels to breathe in unhealthy air, right? So getting you to get an idea through your five physical senses to put you in a place. Um, it also, social reform literature emphasizes systems that influence human life. So in the next slide, I'll talk about naturalism and how naturalism is concerned with the ways in which human beings are influenced by systems in the world. But basically, thinking of Life in the Iron Mills, how the story of Hugh and Deb is a story of characters who are being influenced by larger economic and political systems. However, what social reform literature keeps from melodrama and romanticism that most other forms of literary realism and literary naturalism actually don't like is the didacticism, the didactic nature of melodrama romanticism. Again, think about Joaquin Murrieta, which is I would characterize as romance, much more clearly romance, even as it is kind of it's approaching social reform because the narrator tells us not to judge Joaquin and moralizes about him. Joaquin Murrieta doesn't explicitly critique systemic injustice in the same way, and it is, but it is didactic in what it is telling you to think as the reader, even as it romanticizes Joaquin and the characters as these larger than life dramatic characters. Life in the Iron Mills doesn't do the larger than life stuff. It scales it more back down to realistic scale and realistic five senses. Um, but unlike realism and naturalism, which kind of turn their noses up at how romantic literature tells the reader what to think, um, social reform literature takes all of the realist and naturalist and regionalist style of making you think like you're actually there as the reader and feeding your five senses with detail, but it keeps the moments of the narrator explicitly telling the reader what we should think or feel. And that's what didactic means. Didactic means um, the opposite of show don't tell, right? You've all heard the phrase show don't tell. It's tell in addition to show, right? The didactic writer or the didactic narrator is telling you exactly like what's going on here. Um, which again, that is a more of a thing in romanticism and older stuff in the 19th century. The newer realists and naturalists of the later 19th century don't like it. Social reform literature takes from both sides of that. And this is important. 19th century social reform lit is often characterized by a journalistic or polemical style. So again, it's not just any literature that it's about social issues, but it's the style in which it's delivered. Think about how in Life in the Iron Mills, there is this journalistic gaze, Gaze, that the narrator's eye kind of sees through which the story is seen by the narrator's eye. And then polemical is just a fancy word for like politically didactic, right? And so again, social reform literature in the 19th century, both US and British contexts, is often characterized by a journalistic or polemical style at the level of language, right? So again, it's not just content. I can't emphasize this enough. Social reform literature doesn't just mean literature about social issues. Social reform literature in the 19th century it's about social issues. That's the what, but it addresses those social issues through a didactic, journalistic, polemical style that draws on the detailed attention to the five senses of realism and attention to the systems that impact human life of naturalism and the didactic moralizing of romanticism, right? So that's the how. There's a what and a how when you're studying literature. So really quickly, this I actually use this same exact slide in my lectures in American literature too, but I explain a lot in a lot more depth in that class. For this class, American Lit 1, this is the era of American literary history before realism and naturalism really take off after the Civil War. Um, so just quickly to break down some differences, realism is about character-driven plot. The characters make the plot move. The characters have the agency to move the plot forward. So, as opposed to like um the gods moving the characters, right, in ancient Greek tragedy, or as opposed to even Life in the Iron Mills, I would say Life in the Iron Mills is more naturalist than realist because in Life in the Iron Mills, um, there's really only one action that our protagonists take that drive the plot forward, and that is when Deb steals the money. Other than that, even and you could argue that Deb stealing the money is even something that is preordained by the capitalist system's impact on her. So realism really focuses on how character decisions and character actions are what drives the plot. Naturalism, you can think about the opposite, where it's almost like the plot drives the characters, because naturalism focuses on external modes and forces that control individuals. So in realism, it's about how do individuals and individual lives and decisions drive a plot forward. Naturalism is about how are individuals caught up in larger systems such that in the sense of narrative, the plot drives the characters, right? So who's doing the driving, the characters or the plot? Realism and naturalism are both about fidelity to reality. Realists and naturalists agree that you need to have details that are grounded in real life and not fantasy, but realists are more character driven, naturalists are more plot driven because naturalists are thinking about systems that impact humans. Realists are thinking about how humans drive our lives. So realists have a tendency to elevate the human above the natural world, right? Humans um, are above animals and nature. We make systems. We are not controlled by our environment. We shape our environment. Um, Naturalists tend to put humanity on the same level as nature and animals because naturalists are looking at humans as just one subject within the natural world. Um, Realism is really focused on that photographic accuracy. Naturalism, so photographic accuracy, meaning like when you take a photo, it's the external world, it's the world as it looks. Naturalism really dives more into inner psychological depth, right? What is on the inside of the human. Um, in real life, I can't get inside your head one person to another, right? So it's not realistic for me to have a sense of what's going on in your inner psychology. Naturalists are like, well, it's actually inner psychology that we're interested in. And then there's some names of some important figures in realism and naturalism, which I'm not going to really talk too much about. So I'll just move on from there. Life in the Iron Mills, as I've said throughout this lecture, is a reflection of a particular kind of realism called regionalism, right? So if you can think of like the flow chart or an umbrella, realism is like an umbrella under which you'll find regionalism as a specific type. Life in the Iron Mills, like I said in the last slide, is skews more on the naturalist side. It's both, but it skews more on the naturalist side because of its investment in systematic thinking and the fact that the characters are mostly driven by the plot as opposed to the characters driving the plot. But Life in the Iron Mills is very much a regionalist text because in this story, the story's setting is as powerful of a force as its characters. Um, you'll also see a signature aspect of regionalist writing and literature is an emphasis on dialect, dialogue, and language. So think of the way that that Harding Davis represents the regional Appalachian dialect of industrial Virginia in how Deb um, and Hugh and the rest of the characters speak, and how that comes across through careful dialogue writing. Um, you also want to notice the environmental description. I already spoke about that in an earlier slide, but the way that there's so much emphasis on what this place is like, right? Um, Okay, and then so I mentioned this in class, and I want to say something quickly about it. Notice the verbs that are used. So the verb grope is used a lot in this story, and it's not used in like the kind of way to make it sound like people are being like creepy. It's actually used if you think about the difference between reaching for a doorknob and groping for a doorknob. When you reach for something, it's intentional, right? You reach for it, you know what you're doing, and there's a kind of agency in the verb reach. Groping, if you're groping for a light switch in the dark, you don't know where the light switch is, right? You're kind of just feeling your way. If you're groping for the doorknob, you're kind of like, I need to get my hand on it, but I'm not really like definitively getting at it. And by talking about how these characters who are being disenfranchised by capitalism, who are being exploited as members of the working class, they're groping for something, they're groping for whatever it is they're reaching for, gets at that disempowerment at the level of language, at diction, right? Um, and so I invite you all to look throughout the story for ways that the verb choice gives you a picture of characters who are not definitively in control of their lives, but are groping towards something that they're not sure of, right? Um, yeah, and there's clearly a critique of capitalism and the exploitation of the working class, but not just in dialogue. So the critique isn't just the obvious moments of when a character says the critique, right? Notice how characters are driven by outside forces, and it's not the characters that drive the plot. That is a commentary at the level of literary structure on how capitalism, think about capitalism as the plot, drives characters' lives, drives real people's lives, right? The choices we make in our lives, whether or not to major in the arts and humanities. If your parents told you what you should major in order to make money, you're not making a decision because you want to. You're making a decision because a system is telling you you need to do something a certain way, right? And so at the level of the interaction between characters and plot, that relationship is reflective of the larger social commentary of a story like Life in the Iron Mills, right? So again, it's not just content, it's the how of how the story is constructed. Okay, so here's the end of today's lecture. Um, your response for this week. We have now read quite a few texts which are fictional, but deploy narration styles that are meant to sound like nonfiction. John Roland Ridge and Herman Melville's stories both allude to legal storytelling, and Harding Davis's story posits a narrator who lives in a town and is telling us a true story of real people. So all three stories make it sound like your narrator is telling you this is really what happened. This is a true story, or it's like a legal disposition about a real event that happened, right? This is enormously common in 19th century fiction. Enormously common. It is such a thing for a fictional story to present itself as if it's a true story. So I want you to write a paragraph, not just one or two sentences. Like, give me a good five, six, seven sentences where you really think through what this style means. What does it mean to read, or what does it feel like to read a story that I'm telling you that you know is fiction, but at the level of style is trying to come across as nonfiction? How do you encounter it? How do you think it might be useful? Do you think it has any drawbacks? Do you think it might have come across differently in its own time versus now? Those are all just prompts. You don't have to answer those specific questions. Just generally, I want you to write a few sentences about what it makes you think about to have three three readings in a row, which are clearly fiction, even if in Joaquin Murrieta's case, it is based on a real person. It's still a fictional novel. What is it like to read fiction that sounds so much like it's trying to be nonfiction, right? So I'm going to be interested to see what you all think of that. But that is it for this week's video lecture. Thank you so much.